This is the Canon R5 Mark II, and it might just be the least compromising, most finely crafted hybrid camera that Canon has ever made. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I have resting disinterested face. For disclosure, I borrowed this camera and accessories from Camera Canada. I didn't have any interaction with Canon of any kind during this video. This is a final retail version that my local camera store was kind enough to lend me. It goes back after I'm done, and Camera Canada is awesome for making videos like this possible. This video does have an actual sponsor though, and that's Storyblocks. So let's start with a list of nitpicky complaints before we get into the non-stop wins of this camera. First, while I think the grip and general ergonomics are solid, I do have some issues with the buttons. There are too many of them, they're too small, and too close together. Only some of them can be customized, and the customization options are limited. I totally think you could configure it in a way you'd be happy with, but I doubt you'd be able to use this camera comfortably with winter gloves on, and you should expect a couple annoyances during your initial break-in period. The joystick is also kind of junk. It's convex at the top instead of concave, so if you click it in to select a menu item, you'll also likely move it at the same time, causing you to click the wrong item frequently. This new hot shoe cover is very stiff and difficult to remove, and opening up the card door still shuts off the camera, which is a shame because they've added better relay and backup recording options to this camera, but limiting the card door like this means that hot swapping is impossible. In fact, you can't even charge your battery over USB-C if your card door is open. It just completely cuts the entire power system to the camera. It's weird and can lead you to mistakenly thinking you're charging the camera when you're not. The battery is new, but still underwhelming. It's still an LPE6, they just improved it and added the letter P to the end of it, but it just doesn't hold up by 2024 standards. But we'll get more into battery life and overheating later on. And lastly, the custom white balance tool is still atrocious in video. You still have to switch to photo mode, take a still image of a neutral target, switch back to video, and then white balance from that image. I don't understand why they still can't adopt a one-touch or target-based custom white balance selector in video like every other manufacturer provides. But on the positive side, they've added false color, the zebras work well, and you can even enable a waveform. They even have a log view assist that you can use both on the camera monitor and also display it over HDMI, and you can upload user LUTs to the custom pictures. My only gripe is that some of those tools can't work together and some can't be mapped to custom buttons. So you do have to do some excessive menuing at times to configure them. But that HDMI port is now a full-size Type A, which is great to see, and the rest of the ports are good too, USB-C for power delivery and 3.5mm jacks for microphone and headphone. My only complaint about audio is that they've removed the attenuator from the 3.5mm mic jack, and now you can only use it on hot shoe mics, meaning this camera will not accept a line level signal, it's way too hot. So if you want to pipe XLR mics into the camera, you're either going to need a hot shoe device or an external device that supports mic level output over its 3.5mm. Standard 3.5mm mics worked fine though. The card slots are mixed between CF Express Type B and an SD slot. You only need the CF Express for anything above 600 megabits per second, which includes all the RAW modes, or if you record all intra at 4K 60 and above, or any 8K all intra. Conveniently though, you can shoot 8K and even 4K 120 long GOP to the SD card, and even 4K 60 all intra if you're willing to use the light intraframe variant. And while I appreciate the flexibility in record modes on this camera and also like the new layout for selecting them, I do feel they went a bit overboard. You've got 3 different intraframe bit rates plus long GOP and 4 different codec options for each of those, so users might get paralyzed by choice or be worried they aren't choosing the right codec. But the funny thing is, despite having all those options, there's still some quirks like how you can't shoot intraframe 4K while in H.265. You can only shoot intraframe 8K, but in H.264 it flips. Only 4K intraframe is allowed. I could see this leading to confusion, but I do like that they've made relay and redundant recording possible between the 2 card slots as long as you choose a codec that they both support, except for 8K. You can't do backup recording in 8K, even if you choose long GOP. And they've extended the recording limit to 6 hours for most modes and 2 hours for the high frame rate modes, so none of that 29-minute, 59-second junk we saw at the launch of the R5 Mark I. And there's a useful tally light on the front of the camera that'll even start flashing when you have less than 6 minutes of space left. This is a thoughtful inclusion for creators in front of the camera to give them a heads up when they're about to run out of time. Although, it would be nice if they gave you an estimated time remaining display on the screen when recording like Sony does. On this camera, when you press record, the time remaining is replaced with a new clock that starts ticking up to show how long you've been recording, and you're mostly in the dark about how long you have left, at least until that 6-minute tally light warning starts flashing. And lastly, it has proper DCI frame rates and resolutions, so you can shoot 17:9 at 24.00 frames per second, and the 17:9 actually widens the frame properly instead of just cropping vertically for fake 17:9 like many competitors do. Now, before we go too deep into the sensor testing and me yelling numbers at you for 10 minutes, let's talk briefly about stabilization and autofocus. This autofocus system is fully loaded. There's a ton of different subject detection modes and distinctions that will work well in video and not just photo. And touch tracking on the LCD is good. It also has some functions that you can map to custom buttons, like an autofocus pause toggle, which is handy. And it has the ability to set the autofocus to face only, which is a feature I've always loved on Canon cinema cameras. So when you leave the frame, the autofocus doesn't do anything until it detects the face again. Handy for self-filming. You can't turn off the subject detection with a custom button though, which is useful if you want to stop the camera from detecting faces for a bit. Sony has this, and I find it useful and do miss it here. I found the actual performance of the autofocus to be great, and it seems to be consistent whether at 4K, 8K, 4K 120, RAW, whatever. I couldn't find any obvious autofocus limitations. It was able to track me up to 5 stops overexposed and 4 stops under, and I would feel confident using this for talking head or content creation. It also has control over the speed and responsiveness of that autofocus, which is appreciated. Stabilization on this camera is fine. It can be quite good for making you into a human tripod, but it's not great for follow shots. It has an IBIS module and then 2 levels of digital stabilization you can enable on top. For walking shots, I actually prefer just the base IBIS. It's much more organic looking even if it's not that stable. The digital IS fights back too much and looks jarring at times. Again, good for holding a fixed position handheld, but not something you want to move with. And don't even try to run with this camera. It's not a GH7, you'll need a gimbal for that. I have noticed, however, that when pairing it with certain stabilized lenses, the camera enables an improved combo stabilization mode, and there seems to be less wobble in the corners than on previous Canons. So a bit weaker at times, but more natural looking. However, I suppose if I needed properly stabilized running shots, I should have just downloaded them from Storyblocks, the sponsor of today's video, a stock media platform that offers unlimited downloads of diverse and high quality content for one predictable subscription cost. But Storyblocks is more than just a lazy man's gimbal alternative. Their library also houses over 1 million HD and 4K video files, images, and motion graphics templates. And jokes aside, those motion graphics have actually saved me time on previous projects, especially now that they've added DaVinci Resolve templates. Much better than my previous and tedious method of making those graphics in Photoshop and then animating them in the Edit tab using keyframes. Plus, anything you download from Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free with clear-cut licensing, so you can focus on creating, not worrying about usage rights. The platform is incredibly easy to use, and the library is frequently restocked with commissioned content based on customer demand to ensure you'll have access to files that are not only high quality, but fresh and diverse. So to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/undone or click the link in the description. Okay, now let's talk about the sensor performance. First up, rolling shutter. To read out the full resolution of this greater than 8K sensor, it takes 17.3 milliseconds. So you'll experience that if you shoot 8K RAW up to 30p, 8K HEVC, and even in 4K Fine, which is the oversampled 4K mode. However, if you shoot 8K 60, which can only be done in raw light, the read speed improves to 12.6 milliseconds. This one was a head scratcher for me because everything else seemed the same. There was no added crop, the bit depth didn't change, the dynamic range was the same, even the image quality looked identical. I couldn't understand how they were able to read the whole sensor, but now faster, without anything else changing. But I now have a theory. Since the sensor is more than 8K, perhaps in the other 8K RAW modes, it's fully sampling the entire vertical resolution. But in the 8K 60, it might be skipping or binning the pixels that are greater than the 8K window to quickly get past those and then read out the rest of the 4,320 lines conventionally. If this isn't what it's doing, then I have no idea and I'm stumped. But all you really need to know is that whatever it's doing, it was able to pass all my tests with similar results to the 8K 24. So whatever it is, it's good at it. There's a 4K RAW option as well, which mirrors the read speeds of the 8K versions. So for 4K 24, you'll get 17.3 milliseconds, and 4K 60 is 12.6 milliseconds. Although another head scratcher is that this RAW doesn't appear to be oversampled, but instead line skipped or binned in some way. If we take a close look at a chroma chart, we can see that the pixels are being manipulated differently than in an oversampled recording. And that's fine. Often 4K RAW from an 8K sensor will be line skipped, but you'll get faster read speeds and worse dynamic range because of it. However, on this camera, the read speeds don't improve and the dynamic range doesn't change that much. The noise is slightly more apparent, but I don't think it's just a simple line skipping method. It would seem that they're still reading the sensor the same way as the 8K RAW and then doing something to it afterwards. The result is a confusing one because it makes for a worse image than the 4K Fine oversampled recordings, but at much larger sizes. So I'm not sure the 4K RAW makes a lot of sense on this camera other than to make smaller files than 8K RAW. And also, what the heck does RAW even mean at this point if you can do all these different resolutions and sampling methods? RAW feels a lot more like a buzzword these days and less a proper indication of an image pipeline. That being said, you can fully adjust the ISO, white balance, color space, and gamma in post in DaVinci Resolve with these files, so that's useful. But stepping outside of RAW, if you want to shoot that 4K fine, you're limited to a max of 30 frames per second. So if you want more than that, you'll have to choose the standard 4K, which seems like a more conventional line skipping. The noise performance is worse, the details are softer, moire increases in some cases, but the read speed jumps up to 9.6 milliseconds. However, they've done something to the noise handling in this mode that allows you to get very similar scores in the dynamic range testing that you'll see in a minute. But what's best about this mode is that you can shoot all the way up to 4K 120 without adding a crop. And just like the 60p RAW modes, the 4K 120 also somehow reads out faster than the 4K 24 to 60 modes. In 4K standard, instead of 9.6 milliseconds, the 4K 120 improves to 7.2 milliseconds. I can only assume the same thing I did about the 8K 60, that the extra pixels are being combined more aggressively than the rest of the window, but again, it does this incredibly well because outside of just a touch more noise, you can hardly tell the difference between 4K 24 standard and 4K 120. And for some context to these numbers, the Sony a7S III reads its 4K at around 8 milliseconds, and the Sony Alpha 1 reads its 8K at around 16 milliseconds. So the numbers from the R5 Mark II are on par, slightly slower, but reasonable. I think what makes it impressive is the true flexibility. You can choose the quality and speed you want pretty liberally, which is handy and more useful for a variety of shooting scenarios. Now let's confuse things further by looking at dynamic range. Okay, so what we have here is a dynamic range test result from Imatest. So if you don't know how this process works, normally what I do is I shoot a chart called the Xyla 21, which has individual chips of light, different stops, intensities of light. And so we shoot that and then we analyze with Imatest and it gives us a score. And if we look along the top here, we'll see what I shot, which is 8K 24 RAW on 8K, meaning it's an 8K timeline, which is important because if you put it on a 4K timeline, you're going to get an oversampling effect, which improves the score. It was ISO 800, which is the native ISO in both C-Log 2 and C-Log 3, and this was C-Log 2. And over on the right here, we'll see slope-based DR, 14.9. That is the total amount of stops that it detected, which was 15 stops, which is great. And then down here are noise tolerances. So starting with 1.0, that means it's allowing a decent amount of noise in, and it gives a score of 12.6. And then medium, which is what we normally use as a reasonable test of noise performance, which is a signal noise ratio of 2, gives us a score of 10.9. Interestingly, some tests on this camera came back with a 0 under the 0.1 high, which normally you get something, 3 stops, 4 stops. But to me, what this is saying is that to meet this level of noise tolerance, no stops are that clean. But we're going to focus more on total and medium. And so for medium here, we got 10.9. Now this is the worst that it's going to get. This is 8K RAW, no noise reduction on an 8K timeline, nothing done to it, in C-Log 2, no processing, 10.9. This score is, it's okay. You'd like to see higher than this if it was like a professional cinema camera, but this is usually what you see with these sort of flagship 8K cameras, and then they get better as we go from there. And next I have the 8K 60 Light RAW, and I just wanted to show this because like I said, even though it's reading the sensor faster, you're not actually losing any dynamic range. You can see for the 8K 60 Light RAW on an 8K timeline, we're still getting 10.9 on the medium, so that's good. And now here is 8K 24 RAW with C-Log 3, because what's great about this camera is it has C-Log 2. Canon has been kind of stingy about putting C-Log 2 in a lot of their hybrid mirrorless cameras before, and so this is why it's important. This is why people ask for it. So with C-Log 3, you do see a better medium score. You see 11.8, but you'll notice that the total stops is only 13, where on C-Log 2, it's 15. And that's important because if you're shooting RAW, you want the ability to possibly do noise reduction yourself in post, and having 2 more stops total that you could potentially dig out the noise from is going to produce a better result, and you'll see why in a minute. Now, next up here, we have 8K 24 RAW on a 4K timeline. So this is oversampled a little bit, but not internally. We're doing it in post. We're taking 8K and we're putting on a 4K timeline, and it jumps up to 11.7 stops. But what happens if we let the camera do the noise reduction and the processing? So here we have 8K 24 HEVC. Now, something interesting about H.265 is the way that it compresses the image actually has a benefit to noise performance. It compresses away some of the noise, and you tend to get a better result in Imatest. And you can see here that an 8K 24 H.265 file on an 8K timeline with a little bit of the internal noise reduction that the camera does on its own goes all the way up to 12.5. We still get our 15 stops total, but now we have 12.5 by letting the camera process the image, and this still isn't even oversampled. This is 8K on 8K. If we let the camera also do the oversampling, which is what the 4K 24 fine is, that's an 8K readout, oversampled internally to 4K, recorded in H.265 with a light amount of noise reduction, it jumps all the way up to 13.6. This is one of the best medium scores I've seen on a camera of this class. But I wanted to test this score a little further because I wasn't quite certain that it was legitimate. So I did an 8K24 RAW file. I put it on a 4K timeline, and I did the noise reduction myself in DaVinci Resolve. And I got 13.5 as well, which again is why C-Log 2 is better, because now we have more clean stops than we had total stops detected with C-Log 3. This is why we like C-Log 2. And I have a couple more comparisons for you. Here's the 4K 24 RAW. Again, I'm not exactly sure what they're doing to this image because it reads out the same speed as 8K, but it looks like the pixels are being manipulated a little bit. Anyway, we get 11.9 stops on the medium in RAW, so no noise reduction applied yet. And if we do the 4K 60 RAW, 11.7. This is what I was trying to say, that yeah, it reads out faster, but the dynamic range doesn't drop that much. I'm getting a fifth of a stop difference, which could just be variance in the test. And the same thing if we do the 4K 24 standard. So this one is a fully processed, noise reduced, everything image. Again, 13.5, just like we got before. The weird thing here is this is 4K 24 standard, not 4K fine. So this is the line skipped version, but they're doing something with the noise reduction there. They're kind of blurring it a little bit and it gets softer, but the noise is hidden in a way where it still scores that same 13.5. And even if you shoot 4K 120, you still get 13.5. Which is crazy because the 4K 120 reads faster. It's 120 frames a second. It's usually way more taxing, but it's still full frame, no added crop, same dynamic range. So this is a pretty great result. So overall, you can dig out about 13.5 stops here with an acceptable noise level, signal noise ratio of 2, possibly more if you really want to finesse the raw files in post with your own oversampled noise reduced image. But that's a good result. Now for comparison, the Sony Alpha 1 scores in the high 12s to a flat 13 on the medium, so to make sure the Canon numbers weren't being artificially inflated, I did some side-by-side comparisons of terrible high contrast scenes. I first exposed them each to middle gray on the color chart in that shot, and then I exposed each to fully retain the sky, and then I did one where I pushed and pulled it in post to keep both middle gray on the chart and the sky to see if one would break worse than the other. There are some differences. For example, the Sony held its saturation better, and the Canon seemed to bloom more, but they were surprisingly similar in a lot of ways. I also tested ISO 4000 because when I ran through the ISO range, I noticed the image clean up a bit after ISO 3200. I didn't notice this happen at any other ISO, so it might be a dual native switchover, but sadly, even though it does clean up a bit visually, Imatest measured it as a stop worse than ISO 800. So it's not a perfect second native. But if we move through the rest of the ISO range, you can see that not only does the image remain nice and clean up to ISO 6400, but there's hardly any color shifts. Even ISO 25600 looks identical on the vector scope to ISO 800, which is great. I do find ISO 25600 to be too noisy to use, however. My personal cutoff would be ISO 12800, and again, 4000 is cleaner than 3200. Color overall is solid. It has your typical Canon tendencies, which means that in studio it can lean a little pink, and it tends to go softer on the yellows and cyans, but outdoors in sunlight, you can just throw the LUT on it and move on with your day if you want. Correcting the studio shots isn't a difficult task, but again, it would be a lot easier if they let you capture a custom white balance in camera without all the nonsense. So what about overheating? The source of so much drama with the launch of the R5 Mark I. Is this one better? Yes, much, much better. In fact, you're far more likely to have your battery die than overheat in most modes. I've been doing a bunch of tests in the 4K fine mode since I think that's the best image quality to size choice, and I wanted to see how it handled oversampling for long-form content. And like I said, my battery was the cause of the shutdown after about 1 hour and 20 minutes of recording. But there are some interesting additions regarding overheating. First, they have the standard and high heat threshold settings that the Sony cameras have. When you set it to high, it will let you exceed the low temp burn threshold, but advise you to use the camera on a tripod and not handheld. There's also a new indicator on the screen that has 10 little bars that fill up as the camera gets warmer, keeping you better informed about the thermal performance instead of just shutting down randomly. And when it reaches 4 or 5 bars, it starts warning about those low temp burns on the screen. This doesn't mean the camera's too hot to touch, it just means holding it for long periods can be bad for your hands, and it's best suited for tripod use. And when my battery died after 1 hour and 20 minutes of 4K fine, it was at bar 6 of 10 on that heat meter. Now, you can use the USB-C power delivery to get around that battery life problem, but that won't help with overheating. And then I found out about the new Canon R20 EP battery grip, which not only doubles the amount of LPE6 batteries you're feeding the camera, but also has a cooling fan built in that blows air into the camera via the vent holes on the bottom. This is pretty cool. I like that it's optional so that photo shooters or people with meager video needs aren't encumbered by the additional cost or weight, but that people more focused on video have a decent first-party option. You can control the fan in the menu, and there's 3 speeds. I did some tests on the sound output, and I would say that you can comfortably leave it running at medium during a shoot, but that high should only be used in standby mode, as it's way too loud if you're also recording audio. So I did some tests with the fan set to medium, and it totally works, but you're still going to be battery limited. Even with 2 LPE6P batteries, the power ran out before it overheated. This time I got 2 hours and 37 minutes of 4K fine, and the thermal gauge reaching 5 out of 10. So then I recharged the batteries and tried it again with USB-C power provided. I appreciate that you can charge your batteries over USB-C even with the grip attached, but it's quite slow. You only charge them one at a time, and each takes about 2 hours. I wish this was faster. Anywho, running it on 4K fine with the fan set to medium and USB-C power connected, I was able to record for the full 6-hour limit without it overheating. The gauge did get to 8 out of 10, but it never failed. Oh, and all these tests so far were in a 22°C or 72 Fahrenheit indoor environment. Obviously, your results will vary with the ambient temperature, but for climate-controlled work in a studio, this is fantastic. I did some more experiments with different modes and ambient temperatures as well. In a 25°C or 77 Fahrenheit environment, I could record 4K fine for 4 hours and 21 minutes before it overheated, and in a 28°C, 83F outdoor environment, even though I was in the shade, the runtime dropped to 1 hour and 12 minutes before it overheated. And when I stuck it in the direct sun on that same day, I could only record for 23 minutes, and the exterior of the camera got very hot. I also tested the 8K60 and the 8K24 indoors at that 22°C temp again with the fan set to medium. 8K60 lasted the full 50 minutes until my 1 terabyte card filled up, only reaching 4 out of 10 on the thermal scale, and I could record the 8K24 RAW for 1 hour and 34 minutes before the card filled up, hitting 6 out of 10 on that temp gauge. 4K60 in the same scenario took an hour for the first bar of the heat gauge to even show up, so I shut it down and deemed the 4K60 to not be an issue, but 4K120 overheated very quickly. In fact, even with the fan set to high, which I figured was okay since sound probably isn't an issue for 120p clips, I only got 13 minutes of recording before overheating. But then again, 120p is likely only going to be used for very short shots, and what's cool about this new fan is that you can set it to run just like a cinema camera. So when you're in standby, it can automatically kick on to high and then go down to medium when you press record. And if you pair this technique with the lower quality standby option and the high heat threshold, you can run this camera in a start-stop production use case far longer than any continuous test would suggest. Finally, I disconnected the grip and did a 4K24 standard test to see how long the battery would last with the non-oversampled 4K. And I got 1 hour and 39 minutes before the battery died. The thermal gauge didn't even show up, so I doubt you'll have heat issues in this mode. Again, demonstrating my point that you're more likely to have the battery die than have the camera overheat, at least when using it at 28°C or below. So disappointing battery, but solid overheating results. But just like with the dynamic range and rolling shutter performance, I like that the thermal management and battery life have several different options and workarounds that provide peace of mind in knowing that one way or another, you can get the shot. And it's for those reasons that I have to give this camera my highest praise. I can see some people writing this camera off as Canon playing catch up to Sony and Nikon, but I think that's a mistake. While it's true that in many categories it merely ties the performance of the Alpha 1 or flagship Nikon cameras, I think the flexibility of this new camera is unmatched. And we didn't even mention the absolutely fantastic photo camera this thing is, or the fact that it's $2,200 cheaper than that Alpha 1. Just think about the modes this thing has. 8K60 internal RAW, 4K120 without changing the field of view or dynamic range too much, 4K24 in an oversampled mode if read speed isn't an issue, or a faster 4K mode that reads at sub 10 milliseconds if you can stand to give up 10% of your sharpness, all while keeping the same color, autofocus, sensitivity, and features. It's got Canon Log 2, an optional grip that cools and doubles your battery life, redundant recording, full-size ports, and an updated interface. And while competing flagships also have a bunch of those features, you don't have to pay flagship prices to get this one. It ain't perfect, but it sure is one of the most complete packages we've ever seen from Canon, and is probably the best all-around hybrid camera currently available. All right, I'm done.